Elijah Braxton solved the one equation no one else could. Hours later, he was locked in a federal cell. They didn't see a genius. They saw a threat. Harvard turned its back. The government labeled him a traitor. Travis Klein, the white student who framed him, protect. But just when Elijah was about to lose everything, one voice memo exposed the lie and changed American history. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The snow fell in slow spirals outside Harvard's frosted windows, blanketing the historic campus in a deceptive peace. Inside the mathematics department, the air buzzed with quiet judgment masked as academic discourse. At the center of it all stood Elijah Braxton, chalk in hand, coat slung over the back of a chair, and eyes trained on a theorem that hadn't been touched in 70 years. He wasn't just solving problems, he was reshaping them. Elijah's name was already engraved on the metal plaque. Outside his office, Professor Elijah M. Braxton, Department of Pure Mathematics. But that name, to many, was a thorn. His presence represented disruption, not inclusion. The tenured halls of Harvard hadn't known a black professor in mathematics since 1998, and even that had been a short-lived appointment. Elijah, at 35, had shattered a ceiling without asking for permission or forgiveness. To his students, he was captivating. He taught not like a man with answers, but like someone allergic to easy ones. He'd challenge PhD candidates to throw away calculators and reason with nothing but logic. He'd ask them to imagine math as poetry, to feel its rhythm instead of fearing its rigor. Yet for all his brilliance, his presence was met with thin-lipped smiles from colleagues, the kind that coated resentment with politeness. In faculty meetings, his suggestions were nodded at and promptly ignored. When he submitted papers to the in-house journal, reviewers took months longer than standard, offering feedback that felt deliberately obtuse. And when he won the National Young Mathematician Award last spring, the department chair, Clarence Reynolds, had barely clapped. Behind closed doors, whispers traveled faster than proofs. They said Elijah was a diversity hire, that he hadn't paid his dues, that he was flashy, too media-friendly, too interested in making math popular. You know they fast-tracked him, right? Just to fill the quota, someone had muttered at a donor dinner. But what none of them knew, not Reynolds, not the smug assistant professors, not even the students who idolized him, was that Elijah had solved something dangerous, something that had been shelved for decades, because it mocked modern logic. It was a riddle disguised as a proof, a problem that whispered madness the deeper you went. Elijah had discovered it one late night while combing through digitized archives of obscure math journals. Buried in a 1973 edition of the Mathematical Anomalies Quarterly, he found an unsolved equation titled Only the Santa Hypothesis. It had been dismissed at the time as a hoax, but Elijah saw symmetry beneath the absurdity, and within a month, he had broken its spine. He didn't tell anyone. He kept the work hidden in an offline journal, scribbled in layers of shorthand that only he understood. Because the truth was, the equation wasn't just a joke. It was a trap, a recursive loop of logic that forced the solver to question the very foundation of arithmetic. And solving it revealed patterns that had implications in cryptography, artificial intelligence, even behavioral economics. It was too big to publish, and he didn't trust the university to not take credit. There were days Elijah felt proud, but more often, he felt cornered, trapped in an institution that loved his mind, but hated the skin it came in, that paraded him on brochures for diversity, but denied him department votes, that assigned him the Urban Outreach Committee, but excluded him from core hiring panels. Harvard had given him a platform but not a voice. And then, on a quiet Friday morning in December, everything shifted. His assistant, Vanessa, a meticulous grad student with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, dropped off his mail like always. Bills, a publisher's catalog, and one envelope that didn't belong. It was matte black. No return address. Just white lettering and careful calligraphy. $2,000 for Santa's impossible equation. Elijah stared at it for a long time. His fingers froze before touching it, not from cold but from instinct. Something about the envelope felt staged, like bait. He flipped it over. Sealed. No markings. But it wasn't the envelope that made his heart sink. It was the font, that same serif style, that same spacing. It matched the journal he'd found the original equation in 2 years ago. That equation had never been published outside that obscure 1973 edition. So who else knew about it? As snow thickened outside and the world quieted into winter, Elijah cracked the seal with deliberate calm. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed, clean, deceptively simple. At the top, Santa's equation, version 2. Below that, a complex array of symbols, factorials and nested algorithms that made his breath hitch. It was similar to the first, but this one was restructured, updated, almost like a sequel made by someone who had read his mind. But no one had, because he hadn't told a soul. At the bottom of the page, a signature, C. Reynolds, the department chair, the man who once told Elijah in a private meeting, "Elijah, your brilliance is impressive, but try not to rattle the cage too much. You're here because the system bent for you. Don't forget that." The paper trembled in Elijah's hand. Not from fear, from clarity. This wasn't an offer. It was a challenge. Elijah cracked the first part in under 60 seconds. Then his computer shut off, and the screen flashed a single line, "Unauthorized access detected. You've triggered the algorithm." The screen flickered once, then went black. Elijah's hands hovered over the keyboard, frozen not from confusion, but from the sharp punch of foreboding that hit his gut. His office had no cameras, but somehow he hell watched. The silence was unnerving, interrupted only by the faint hum of the building's old heating system. In his mind, he retraced the logic of the first part he'd just cracked. The equation was bizarre in structure, but elegant in its deconstruction. The symbols were layered in sequences that mimicked advanced encryption, making it appear nonsensical unless decoded. That was no accident. Whoever restructured the Santa equation had done so with military precision. The $2,000 offer now seemed like the smallest part of the mystery. On its surface, it was an academic riddle, circulated annually as an inside joke among a closed circle of theoretical mathematicians. But this version was something different, something darker. And the name printed beneath it, Reynolds, elevated it from a puzzle to a provocation. Clarence Reynolds was not just the department chair. He was the gatekeeper of institutional legitimacy. The same man who once reminded Elijah, in a half-empty auditorium, that black minds lack mathematical discipline. That sentence had stuck in Elijah's memory like a tattoo inked in acid. Reynolds's prejudice was never loud. It was structural, laced into committee exclusions, delayed funding, and paper rejections. The envelope wasn't an olive branch. It was a landmine. For most professors, the $2,000 tag might have felt like a holiday prank. But for Elijah, it was an insult wrapped in a test. If he solved it, they'd question how he got access. If he ignored it, they'd whisper that he wasn't up to the challenge. Either path fed the system's appetite for doubt. He rebooted the computer. The screen blinked on but skipped the usual login. Instead, it displayed a strange progress bar labeled Remote Diagnostic Scan. The top corner flashed a warning in red. Access flagged under Federal Review Protocol. Federal? Elijah's jaw tightened. His cursor wouldn't move. None of his keys responded. Then the screen went black again. A single line emerged in white text. Your session has been captured. Do not restart. This wasn't just university-level security. Someone external was watching. Panic would have been natural, but Elijah had trained himself against emotional tells. He stood slowly, walked to the window, and gazed out over the snow-covered quad. The students below moved like ghosts, unaware that something extraordinary was unfolding just floors above. His eyes moved to the Santa equation again. Every line of it felt personal. The encryption style mirrored techniques developed in high-level data compression algorithms. Some of the symbol placement mimicked code he'd seen years ago during a collaborative stint with MIT's AI lab. But the strange part? One section of the equation seemed lifted directly from a side project he had never published. Someone had been watching his research for longer than he'd thought. The implications struck like a lightning bolt. This wasn't just about math. The Santa equation wasn't a joke. It was a test, and Elijah was the lab rat. And Reynolds? He wasn't acting alone. That thought shifted the atmosphere in the room. It was as though the walls leaned closer, ready to listen. He returned to his desk and carefully slid the printed equation back into its envelope. He tucked it beneath a stack of unrelated journals, then pulled out a legal pad. If they were monitoring his machine, he wouldn't give them more data. He'd solve it the old way. Chalk, paper, mind. An hour passed. Then the symbols began to collapse inward, like dominoes. Patterns emerged, functions dissolved into identities. What started as gibberish unraveled into deliberate complexity. It was not just solvable. It was elegant. Too elegant for Reynolds to have created. That was the twist. Reynolds didn't write it, but he signed it, which meant someone else had written it. And Reynolds had either stolen or co-opted the work, which meant this was bigger than Harvard. Elijah leaned back, the weight of revelation pressing against his ribcage. Without warning, a message popped up on his personal phone, one he never connected to university servers. You weren't supposed to solve that. The morning after Elijah received the anonymous text, Harvard's campus became unrecognizable. It wasn't that the buildings had changed or that the snow-covered quad had lost its quiet charm. No, what changed was the energy, the shift in the air when he walked into Maxwell Hall. Something in the way people glanced at him and then quickly looked away. The normal cadence of academic life had been replaced with unease, the kind that comes before an execution. He knew something was wrong when his ID badge turned red at the faculty entrance. Security didn't bark orders. They didn't have to. One of them, a younger guard who had always offered polite nods, walked him to the administrative office without saying a word. There was no accusation, just procedure. Quiet, polite hostility, the kind reserved for people who were being slowly erased. When he reached his office, he found two members of Harvard's IT staff already there, gloves on, carefully packing up his equipment like they were dismantling a crime scene. His desk drawers had been emptied. His whiteboard had been wiped clean. Years of work, ideas, proof chains, gone in seconds. The sight of them holding his personal notebooks, flipping through pages of algorithms, formulas and research he had never submitted, it knocked the air out of him. No one made eye contact. No one explained. It didn't matter that he was the youngest tenured math professor at Harvard. It didn't matter that students loved him, that his lectures packed rooms, that his algorithm breakthroughs had been cited across 4 disciplines. All that brilliance vanished under the weight of suspicion, because the rules shifted when the subject is a black man. His phone buzzed with a university alert. Professor Elijah Braxton, under review for possible violation of intellectual property policy. The message was sterile, but it set the tone. The language said nothing, but said everything. It told the world, we're distancing ourselves. It painted him as dangerous without needing to prove it. Within hours, his name trended. Not for his achievements, but for the scandal. Whispers ran like wildfire through academic Twitter. Reddit threads emerged filled with anonymous users speculating on his guilt. I always thought he was overrated, someone wrote. Affirmative action fraud caught, echoed another. And beneath it all were those with deeper hate. Those who didn't even bother with pretense. The ones who posted, "This is why math should stay with the disciplined." Elijah could feel the isolation tightening like a noose. He'd always known he stood on unstable ground, walking a tightrope between institutional acceptance and erasure. But this was public execution. The story went deeper than what the students and blogs knew. Harvard's IT department had flagged Elijah's computer for unusual access patterns after he interacted with the Santa equation. They claimed the file was hosted on a restricted internal server, reserved for advanced encryption research. The official version, he somehow accessed classified material. Harvard treated it not as an academic curiosity, but as a breach, and worse, as theft. But Elijah never requested access. He never even logged into the Harvard network to get the equation. It had been mailed to him. Printed. Anonymous. Deliberate. None of that mattered. That afternoon, the Office of Academic Integrity delivered a sealed notice to his home. Inside, formal charges. Allegations of academic misconduct, data tampering, and breach of internal firewall protections. The language wasn't accusatory, it was prosecutorial, cold, surgical, and deeply racist in its assumptions. He was suspended from all teaching duties pending investigation. Access to the campus server was revoked. His students were reassigned. And for the first time in his professional life, Elijah Braxton, the boy who grew up solving equations on diner napkins in Atlanta, was officially uninvited from his own classroom. The emotional weight didn't come all at once. It came in waves. He remembered the hallway where a janitor had once stopped to tell him, "My daughter watches your lectures on YouTube every night." That same janitor now avoided his gaze. He remembered the chalkboard, where he'd scribbled out the first version of the adaptive growth algorithm that earned him a grant, now wiped clean by strangers in latex gloves. He remembered walking across campus like he belonged. Now he walked like a shadow. And then came the leak. Someone within Harvard's administration. Elijah would never know who fed a story to the press. that he had used backdoor methods to obtain the Santa equation. No details. Just enough poison to let the media frenzy grow teeth. He was no longer a professor. He was a suspect. That night, his phone buzzed with a notification from a student podcast titled, "When Genius Turns to Theft." The discussion framed Elijah not as a victim, but as a mystery. They speculated about how someone so confident could have made such a careless mistake. One of the guests, a smug white doctoral candidate, described Elijah as an example of how diversity hires sometimes become accountability risks. Elijah didn't finish the episode, but the audio haunted him. His own assistant, Vanessa, had grown distant. Once eager to talk theory, now she avoided his calls. She didn't reply to emails. She didn't stop by his home, as she used to when working on joint research. He felt the wedge, the pressure, the fear. No one wanted to be associated with a sinking ship, especially not a black one. And then, just as the emotional dam threatened to crack, an unexpected twist, an anonymous email arrived. No subject, no body text, just an attachment, metadata logs. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. Then the pieces clicked. It was an internal access log from Harvard's secure network, one that showed who accessed the file labeled Equation Santa Restricted. The name was there. T. Klein. Travis Klein. Elijah's blood ran cold. Travis was a C-grade math major, a legacy student, the kind of young man who coasted through academia on his last name. His father had donated millions to Harvard. Travis had once stormed out of Elijah's lecture, after failing a midterm, claiming the test was biased. Elijah had dismissed it, ignored the tantrum, never thought twice. Now it was clear. Travis had accessed the file. Travis had the clearance. Travis had the motive. It wasn't Elijah who hacked anything. It was Travis who planted the bait. The question now wasn't whether Elijah was innocent. It was whether anyone would believe him. And the answer was already written in the way the university erased him. They didn't need facts. They needed a fall. At the disciplinary hearing, the panel demanded Elijah explain how he accessed the unreleased equation. But Elijah never received it from Harvard. The disciplinary hearing had adjourned, but the damage was already spreading like smoke through the halls of Harvard. Elijah walked out of the room, not as a professor defending his integrity, but as a man already presumed guilty. Behind him, institutional silence loomed like a verdict waiting to be announced. Outside the administration building, a slow-burning truth settled over him, heavier than rage, colder than fear. If the Santa equation had never come from Harvard, and the server logs pointed toward Travis Klein, then the smiling, entitled student Elijah once brushed off had done more than just resent him. He had orchestrated his fall. Travis Klein had always moved through Harvard with the certainty of someone whose place was never questioned. The son of Arthur Klein, a major donor whose name adorned one of the campus's newest libraries. Travis didn't need to earn his place. It had been carved for him. Though he barely scraped through his coursework, he walked the grounds like a prince, backed by unspoken protection. In Elijah's class, however, that entitlement meant nothing. Grades were earned, expectations were enforced, and the hierarchy Travis relied on had no power in Elijah's logic-driven classroom. The friction had started months ago. Travis, unable to grasp the complexity of Elijah's syllabus, floundered through assignments and performed poorly on every exam. Each failed attempt chipped away at the illusion of superiority that had cocooned him since childhood. Elijah noticed the subtle changes, the clenched jaw when returning a graded test, the tone laced with sarcasm when answering in class. Still, he gave Travis the same opportunity he gave every student, a fair chance. But fairness wasn't what Travis wanted. He wanted obedience. He wanted submission. What Elijah couldn't have predicted was how far Travis would go once he realized he couldn't win with skill. Behind the scenes, Travis turned to the only asset he had, his last name. Leveraging his father's influence, he submitted a fabricated research request to gain temporary access to the mathematics department's secure archive. The request sailed through the system unchecked. No one questioned Klein. Deep within those digital files, he found a series of encryption experiments, one of which had been unofficially nicknamed Santa's equation by a faculty researcher years ago. It was never meant to be solved. It was an exercise in abstraction, used as a curiosity among cryptographers, something theoretical and incomplete. But to Travis, it was ammunition. He printed the prototype, doctored the layout to mimic a puzzle format, and removed identifying metadata. He slid it into a matte black envelope, and with calculated intent, delivered it anonymously to Elijah's office. To Travis, this was genius. He would bait the professor, tempt him into solving a restricted file, then watch as the system devoured him for it. He never imagined Elijah would actually solve it. Not with such speed, not with elegance. That single moment shattered the illusion Travis had of superiority. In a blink, the trap he laid backfired. Elijah's solution triggered an internal security alert. The algorithm he used to solve the problem was advanced enough that it pinged multiple monitoring systems. And Travis, realizing the digital trail would trace back to his login credentials, made his next move with cold precision. He lied. He crafted a narrative in private conversations, whispering that Elijah must have hacked the file from his laptop. No proof, no complaint filed. Just enough plausible deniability to push suspicion away from himself. And Harvard didn't even question it. They didn't call him in. They didn't audit his access. They didn't check the time-stamped metadata, or ask how a legacy student with a 2.9 GPA obtained an internal file tied to faculty research. They simply believed him, because Travis Klein was theirs, and Elijah Braxton was not. As the investigation deepened, Elijah noticed how rapidly his support network disintegrated. Faculty who once praised him fell silent. Students once eager to be seen with him stopped replying to messages, and Vanessa, his brilliant, diligent assistant, kept her distance. Elijah walked through the quad like a ghost wrapped in shame he did not own. Meanwhile, Travis thrived. He smiled his way through classes, joked with peers, updated his Instagram with fraternity photos under holiday lights. He presented himself as untouched, untouchable. Because he was. Not once did Harvard issue a statement about his role. Not once was he named in any inquiry. But truth, even when buried, has a way of resurfacing. Late one night, as Elijah sifted through metadata logs forwarded by an anonymous source, something shifted. One particular entry stood out. A file marked Equation Santa Restricted, DET, had been accessed and exported days before Elijah ever saw the envelope. The export notation matched Travis's login. Travis hadn't just viewed the equation, he had copied it. He had built the trap from inside the system, and used it to stage Elijah's collapse. Elijah's stomach turned, not from shock, but from recognition. He had always known the system didn't require a smoking gun to take him down. All it needed was a whisper, spoken by the right kind of person. And Travis Klein was the perfect mouthpiece. The hearing that followed became a formality, the panel more interested in confirming suspicion than investigating facts. When Elijah calmly explained that the equation had been mailed to him anonymously, they exchanged glances that said more than words ever could. It wasn't the story they wanted. It wasn't the story that made sense in their version of the world. Because in that version, black excellence was either exceptional or fraudulent, never normal. The hearing adjourned without decision, but the verdict had already been carried out. Hours later, as Elijah walked across the quad, a campus security officer approached, not a man he recognized. Dressed formally, detached, professional, he handed Elijah a paper and recited the words mechanically. Your teaching privileges are suspended pending further review. The words floated in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Elijah barely nodded. What followed was worse. He was escorted not to a private exit or a side door, but across the very heart of the campus, in full view of students. The same students who had packed his lectures, who once emailed him at midnight for advice, now stood silently, watching as he was walked like a warning. Phones came out. Whispers spread. No one spoke to him. And in that silence, Elijah felt something snap. Not rage, not fear, but clarity. Elijah's teaching privileges are suspended, and campus security escorts him out, in front of his students. The suspension should have been the worst day of Elijah's life, but it was only the beginning of something far more sinister. By the next morning, the narrative had spiraled far beyond academic misconduct. The university's silence created a vacuum, and in that vacuum, speculation grew deep. Elijah woke to dozens of missed calls, not from colleagues or students, but from unknown numbers, blocked numbers, and media outlets desperate to grab a headline before anyone else could. It wasn't until he checked his voicemail that the true turning point revealed itself. A clipped cold message informing him that federal authorities required him for questioning. No explanation, no courtesy, just an order thinly disguised as a request. And within the hour, 2 unmarked government vehicles pulled up outside his apartment building. The world outside his window had not changed. Snow still clung to branches. Students still hurried past in scarves and boots. Yet everything felt warped, as if reality had shifted a fraction to the left. The agents who approached his door did not display aggression, nor did they offer reassurance. They simply presented their badges with mechanical precision and informed him calmly that he would be accompanying them. Their neutrality made the moment more unnerving, a reminder that institutions didn't need force when they had authority. He stepped outside without resistance, not because he felt safe, but because he understood how danger disguised itself when dealing with government scrutiny and Harvard's influence. The ride to the federal field office was long and heavy with unspoken tension. Elijah stared at the window, watching the blurred landscape of Boston rush past, but the reflection staring back at him looked like a stranger. In the fluorescent interrogation room, the temperature felt artificially cold, deliberately uncomfortable. What followed was not an inquiry about mathematics or encryption, but a character dissection masked as a security evaluation. The agents questioned him not on algorithms or research protocols but on his background, his childhood, his neighborhood growing up, and his supposed connections. They used phrases like patterns of behavior and risk indicators, all of which carried a familiar coded sting. He had felt this before in airports, in department stores, in wealthy neighborhoods where he jogged and was watched as if trespassing simply by existing. But experiencing it in a federal context, with the weight of government machinery behind it, was a revelation in brutality. They asked about his loyalty to the country, as though brilliance made him suspect. They referenced his parents' occupations, subtly implying instability. They questioned his travel history with an undertone that felt less like curiosity and more like accusation. Every minute chipped away at his dignity, replacing it with the sharp reminder that being exceptional and black in America came with a cost. Scrutiny intensifies, suspicion multiplies, and forgiveness evaporates. Hours blurred into a kind of psychological exhaustion that felt more draining than any academic challenge he had ever faced. The agents probed him about research collaborations, past conversations, and even personal friendships. Not once did they ask how or why he solved the Santo equation so quickly. Their interest wasn't in the mathematics. It was in crafting a profile that fit the narrative Harvard had quietly allowed to grow. As the interrogation deepened, Elijah realized that the Santo equation had triggered national security protocols, not because he had accessed it, but because the government had been experimenting with its encryption potential. Someone, somewhere, had flagged his rapid solution as a breach, and instead of investigating the true source, the system chose the easiest target. What made it worse was the implicit disbelief woven into every question. The agent spoke as if he could not possibly possess such intellectual power without ulterior motives. His genius was treated not as a gift, but as a threat. Every answer he gave was met with skepticism, as though the truth sounded too clean to be trusted. When he mentioned that he had received the equation anonymously, their expressions shifted into something like condescending amusement. They didn't believe him, or worse, they believed him and simply didn't care. By the 12th hour of interrogation, Elijah asked for legal representation. The response was immediate and brutal. He would not be granted access to a lawyer until the National Security Review period concluded. They withheld food, withheld updates, withheld explanations. The fluorescent lights remained bright and unyielding, and the air conditioning hummed with mechanical indifference. Suspicion wrapped around him, like chains. Even though no one had touched him, they didn't need physical force. Psychological confinement was far more effective. For 72 hours, Elijah was denied representation. 72 hours of repeated questions, of veiled accusations, of insinuations that he did not belong in the academic worlds he had fought so hard to enter. They asked about his colleagues, probing for improprieties that didn't exist. They asked about his family history, searching for vulnerabilities they could exploit. They even asked about his awards, subtly implying they may have been given for reasons other than merit. Every question hammered the same message: black achievement was always suspicious. Meanwhile, outside the federal office, the world devoured the story. Harvard remained silent, feeding the media frenzy. Headlines evolved from rumor to indictment. Social media amplified the narrative, with gleeful cruelty, shaping Elijah into a caricature of corruption. News commentators speculated on whether he had ties to foreign entities, calling him an unpredictable academic with questionable access. They dissected his background, his teaching methods, his interviews from previous years, twisting them into something sinister. Students who once admired him now filled group chats with speculation and fear. Professors who once shook his hand now avoided his name. And those who hated seeing him rise those threatened by his brilliance, suddenly found validation in the scandal. They claimed they always sensed something off. They cited stereotypes disguised as concern. They spread rhetoric designed to justify their prejudice. Without lifting a finger, the system turned him from Harvard's prodigy into a national threat. What made the situation unbearably cruel was that Elijah had no way to respond. He was trapped in a room while the world decided who he was. Every passing hour chipped away at his identity, reshaping him into the villain people wanted him to be. By the third day, exhaustion blurred his thoughts, but clarity emerged through the haze. Someone had engineered this destruction with meticulous precision. The trap had collapsed exactly as intended, and now the entire country watched as he was dismantled piece by piece. Late on the third night, an agent re-entered the room with a file in hand. The man did not offer any updates or explanations. He simply placed the folder on the table and left. Elijah opened it with trembling hands, not from fear but from the crushing weight of inevitability. The folder contained a series of printouts, online articles posted within the last hour. His name, photo, and university affiliation were plastered across every headline. The wording was violent in its ardent, stripped of nuance or caution. One headline froze his breath. Harvard professor in custody for national security breach. His world collapsed in silence, not with explosions or chaos, but with the quiet precision of a system that had never intended to let him walk free. News outlets release a headline: Harvard professor in custody for national security breach. Elijah had once believed that if he worked twice as hard, followed every rule, and stayed silent through injustice, the world would eventually respect him. But now, as he sat in federal custody, that illusion crumbled beneath the weight of headlines branding him a traitor. The world outside had turned toxic, not because he had failed, but because he had succeeded too visibly, too powerfully, in spaces not designed for him. Within hours of the first news alert, social media transformed into a courtroom, and Elijah was sentenced without trial. Right-wing influencers leapt at the chance to brand him a woke fraudster, spinning his arrest into a cautionary tale about diversity gone wrong. They played old interviews of him challenging systemic bias and used them as evidence of his radical agenda. Talk show hosts mocked him with smug laughter, labeling him a dangerous intellectual, as if knowledge in black hands was inherently subversive. The term black privilege began trending, a bitter, sarcastic inversion of his reality. The ridicule didn't stop there. Meme accounts circulated photoshopped images of Elijah in an orange jumpsuit, teaching calculus behind bars, with captions like Professor of Espionage 101. Others used digital blackface, reviving old racist caricatures, now dressed in Ivy League robes. The speed and volume of content were overwhelming. Every post chipped away at the man he once was, replacing him with an invented monster that fit their narrative of threat. Even more gutting than the attacks were the absences. Students he had mentored erased their associations. Mentions of him were quietly scrubbed from academic bios. One doctoral student he had personally recommended for a grant removed every reference to their collaboration. His inbox, once filled with admiration, now sat cold and empty. Colleagues stopped returning calls. Silence took on a new form, not absence, but betrayal. Harvard's alumni too joined the chorus. Influential donors and former graduates released open letters demanding his termination. They cloaked their bigotry in institutional language, claiming he had undermined public trust and damaged the credibility of Harvard's faculty. Not a single letter asked how a private algorithm meant for internal research ended up in the hands of a tenured professor with no access to the servers. The system didn't want facts, it wanted a body, and Elijah's was already on the altar. Inside the gray walls of federal holding, Elijah heard only fragments of this chaos. He wasn't online, he had no phone, but he felt it in the shifting tones of the guards, the clipped words of interrogators, and the way his lawyer looked at him, with concern, yes, but also with quiet horror at how fast things had escalated. Harvard remained silent. Not a single statement. Not even a line to clarify the facts. This wasn't negligence. It was strategy. To speak would be to admit involvement, and to admit involvement was to open themselves to liability. So the institution that once praised Elijah's revolutionary mind now erased him to preserve its brand. They let him bleed publicly, knowing that defending him would cost too much. Yet even in the shadow of this silence, voices emerged. Black scholars across the country began to mobilize. Academic think pieces surfaced, analyzing Elijah's fall through the lens of race, intellectualism, and institutional betrayal. A coalition of black faculty members from top universities published an open letter calling for justice. They demanded Harvard speak, demanded that the truth be acknowledged, not just for Elijah, but for every black academic punished for being exceptional. But their advocacy struggled to reach beyond scholarly circles. The media didn't want nuance. They wanted narrative, and Elijah's story had already been set in stone. He was not the gifted professor anymore. He was the arrogant genius who had gone too far. America didn't know what to do with a black man who wasn't broken, so they broke him and called it order. Inside the federal building, Elijah's legal team finally secured access. His lawyer, a seasoned civil rights attorney named Miles Durant, brought sobering news. The Department of Defense had taken a personal interest in the case. The Santa equation, as it turned out, had been part of a top-secret encryption pilot with potential military applications. Harvard's research division had been collaborating with a defense contractor, and the algorithm Elijah solved on paper without server access was not just theoretical anymore. It was classified. That changed everything. What should have been an internal university matter had now become a federal security breach. The government didn't care that Elijah had received the equation through an anonymous envelope. They didn't care that he hadn't asked for it. They cared only that he saw it, and that he cracked it. And because no one expected a black mathematician to do that unaided, suspicion bloomed like poison. They didn't say it outright, but the undertone was unmistakable. You're not supposed to be this smart. You're not supposed to see what you saw. And if you did, someone must have helped you. That evening, Elijah was told that he would be released on bail. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Perhaps this nightmare was starting to end. But just as the paperwork was being processed, a federal officer entered with a sealed envelope. The room grew still. Miles read the contents, and his face changed. The Department of Defense was filing formal charges under the Espionage Act. The bail was rescinded. Elijah was no longer just a professor under suspicion. He was a national threat, accused of unauthorized possession of classified material. And once again, the walls of his world closed in. Just as Elijah is about to be released on bail, he's informed that the Department of Defense is filing charges under the Espionage Act. While Elijah sat confined in a federal detention cell, the machinery of injustice grinding against him with relentless force, a spark ignited in an unexpected place. A quiet apartment just blocks from Harvard. Vanessa King, Elijah's former assistant, sat alone in the glow of her laptop screen, staring at a single voice memo that had been sent to her from an unknown number. Her thumb hovered over the play button, nerves fraying beneath the surface. She had not defended Elijah publicly. She hadn't said much of anything. Part of her had resented the way he overshadowed everything around him. A black academic giant, whose brilliance left little space for others like her. His downfall had felt distant, tragic, but not personal, until now. The audio began with background noise. Music, laughter, the muffled energy of a college party. And then, clearly unmistakably, came the voice of Travis Klein. His arrogance oozed through every syllable as he laughed, declaring to an unseen crowd, "I baited Braxton with the Santa thing. Let's see how the quota genius handles federal heat." The recording continued with drunken laughter from others and another chilling line from Travis. "Kid solves it like a machine. Too bad he won't see sunlight after this. Cheers to the long game." Vanessa froze. The words pulsed in her ears like a slow explosion. In an instant, every doubt she'd ever held about Elijah dissolved. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a trap, designed with precision and fueled by racism. And she had stood silently on the sidelines while it unfolded. Her hands trembled as she replayed the audio, confirming what her mind refused to believe. Travis had orchestrated the entire setup, and done so with joy. The guilt arrived quickly. It hit her like a wave, rising up through her spine, and choking her thoughts. She had judged Elijah. She had questioned his pride, his decisions, even his integrity. She had thought his downfall was self-inflicted. But it wasn't pride that destroyed him. It was a white boy's arrogance, and a system that didn't care to question it. She knew what she had to do. She composed an email to Elijah's attorney, Miles Durant. No pleasantries, no subject line, just the audio file attached. And beneath it, one simple sentence: "You need to hear this." Miles received the email in the middle of a phone call. At first he nearly ignored it. Just another ping in the chaos of a day filled with interviews, filings, and unreturned calls. But when he saw Vanessa's name, he paused. He clicked the attachment. He hit play. What he heard made his skin crawl. It was the kind of evidence lawyers pray for but rarely find. Not just a confession, but one soaked in racist intent, premeditated harm, and institutional manipulation. Miles ended his call without apology, flagged the email for legal preservation, and booked a flight to Boston. That same evening, this wasn't a strategy shift. It was a declaration of war. Across Harvard's campus, Vanessa moved swiftly. She backed up her research, cleared her desk, and prepared to walk away from everything she had built. She knew what was coming. Harvard would not take this revelation lightly. She'd be labeled a traitor, a liability, an opportunist. They'd question her credibility, her motives. They'd try to isolate her, slowly dismantling her academic future. But silence was no longer an option. What haunted her more than her own risk was how easily this could have stayed buried. How close the truth came to never being heard. She wondered how many other black academics had been dismantled like this, their brilliance erased by whispers, traps, and procedural betrayal. Elijah wasn't an outlier. He was a pattern. As the sun set on Cambridge, word of the audio recording began to circulate through legal back channels. Only a few had heard it: attorneys, advocates, insiders. But its existence changed everything. It didn't just implicate Travis. It raised questions about the university's internal awareness, its complicit silence, and the systems in place that enabled the lie to grow without friction. While Elijah sat in his cold cell, unaware of the shift unfolding outside, the truth finally had a voice. Vanessa forwards the audio to a civil rights lawyer, who immediately flies to Boston. The sound of the gavel had not yet faded when the legal storm erupted. Less than 72 hours after receiving the audio file, civil rights attorney Miles Durant stood before a row of cameras outside the federal courthouse in Boston. His suit was crisp, his stance steady, but his voice cut through the winter air with the calm fire of a man who had spent years preparing for this exact moment. He wasn't there for optics. He wasn't pleading for sympathy. He was holding Harvard and the Department of Defense accountable publicly and unapologetically. The lawsuit filed that morning was historic in scope and scathing in detail. It sought $100 million in damages for racial discrimination, malicious prosecution, unlawful detainment, and systemic negligence. Travis Klein's recorded confession was the centerpiece, but the real weight of the case lay in what it revealed about institutional racism, dressed in protocol. How elite systems cloak their biases beneath layers of procedure, always calibrated to protect whiteness while punishing brilliance in black skin. Inside the filing, the evidence spoke volumes. Metadata logs, showing Travis's unauthorized access to the Santo equation weeks before Elijah's arrest, were backed by timestamps and digital trails. Elijah's complete lack of access to those files was equally verifiable. The trap had been laid and the university had either turned a blind eye, or worse, knowingly allowed it to unfold. When the press got hold of the story, the narrative shifted overnight. Media that once framed Elijah as a potential traitor now portrayed him as a victim of racial sabotage. Social platforms exploded with support. Think pieces questioned the integrity of academic institutions. Civil rights advocates compared the case to historical witch hunts of black intellect. And protesters appeared outside Harvard's gates, their signs reading, "Excellence is not a threat," and "Stop silencing black minds." Inside the detention center, Elijah remained stoic. Miles brought him the news in fragments during brief visits, trying not to overwhelm him. When Elijah learned about the lawsuit and the public's response, he didn't smile. He nodded slowly, the gravity of the moment not lost on him. He knew what this meant, not just for him but for every black scholar forced to shrink, dilute, or disappear in order to survive in spaces that were never built for them. When asked for a public statement, Elijah refused to talk about the equation. Instead, he handwrote a letter, one meant not to defend himself, but to indict the system. He wrote of the pain of having to work twice as hard to be seen as half as capable, of being held to higher standards and still accused of lowering the bar, of knowing that his very presence had always been interpreted as defiance. The letter was published by The Atlantic and syndicated nationally. One quote in particular resonated across social media and news outlets. "They didn't punish me for breaking a rule. They punished me for reminding them that I never needed their permission to be brilliant." In less than 24 hours, Elijah Braxton became more than a case study. He became a symbol. But Harvard was not finished. In a chilling move, the university responded not with accountability, but retaliation. They filed a countersuit, claiming breach of contract, reputational damage, and misuse of university materials. It was a strategic maneuver not to win in court, but to drain Elijah's resources, shift the narrative, and scare others into silence. The message was clear: we don't just destroy our outcasts, we erase our threats. The countersuit was designed to isolate Elijah further, but it misfired. Legal scholars across the country condemned Harvard's actions as reputational warfare. Civil rights organizations pledged legal support. Over 2,000 black academics signed an open letter demanding the countersuit be dropped. Even some of Harvard's own alumni called for an independent review of the institution's response. Still, the machinery of punishment kept grinding. Quietly, behind closed doors, Harvard turned its gaze toward Vanessa King. The young graduate student who had exposed Travis's confession received an unmarked envelope from the registrar's office. It was brief, cold, bureaucratic. Her academic standing was under review. Her housing would be revoked. She had 48 hours to vacate university property. No hearing, no chance to contest. Just an order to disappear. The message was loud in its silence. We do not reward disobedience. Vanessa didn't cry. She packed in silence, stacking her books into boxes with the kind of resolve that grows only from betrayal. She had believed that truth would offer protection. She had believed that exposing a lie would earn her integrity. But institutions don't reward whistleblowers. They erase them. As she rolled her suitcase across the icy path that led away from her dorm, a group of students watched. One of them, a freshman she had once mentored, stepped forward, brow furrowed in confusion. "Why are they doing this to you?" he asked softly. Vanessa looked at him, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. She could have explained. She could have recounted every detail. But instead she said nothing, because she knew the real question was, why does this always happen to us? Vanessa finds herself expelled with 48 hours to vacate student housing. The aftermath of the lawsuit rippled through Harvard's elite corridors like a quiet earthquake, the kind that doesn't crack foundations but shifts them just enough to reveal where loyalties truly lie. Publicly, the university issued calm, calculated statements about ongoing investigations and respecting due process. But behind closed doors, they scrambled. Department heads held emergency meetings. The PR team worked overtime. Legal counsels reviewed every email Elijah had ever sent. And while external outrage raged louder with each day, Harvard's internal response turned colder, more precise, and far more dangerous. Elijah had spent his entire career navigating the quiet racism of academic spaces. But this was different. Now the very people who had once invited him to keynote conferences, co-author papers, and serve on diversity committees were turning their backs, not loudly, but methodically. It began with unanswered messages. Then came cancellations of scheduled panels, invitations rescinded, projects indefinitely postponed. Dr. Gerald Whitmore, a senior tenured professor who had once praised Elijah's algorithm as generational, sent a 2-line email. "Due to legal uncertainties, I will be withdrawing from our joint manuscript submission. Wishing you the best." Elijah didn't bother replying. Whitmore had sat across from him at countless faculty dinners, but when pressure mounted, even familiarity proved disposable. Then came the academic plagiarism. Elijah discovered a peer-reviewed paper in a prominent journal bearing eerie similarities to an unpublished algorithm he'd developed 2 years ago. The author? A former research collaborator, someone with access to Elijah's original drafts. When Elijah flagged it through his lawyer, the journal quietly retracted the paper. There was no apology, no admission, just silent erasure. But the most painful betrayal came not from strangers or white academics, but from within. A few black faculty members, ones who had once shared stories of navigating the same racism, Elijah now faced, began to publicly distance themselves. One anonymously told a campus paper that Elijah had always been a bit too confrontational, and that his downfall was tragic but not entirely surprising. Another called him brilliant but volatile. Elijah read their comments in silence, numb to the sting but wounded all the same. Their words didn't just betray him, they validated the institution that wanted him gone. Even Vanessa, exiled from her graduate housing and cut off from university funding, found herself isolated. Though she had delivered the smoking gun, she was now treated as radioactive. She attempted to organize a town hall discussion about systemic racism in academia. The administration ignored her proposal. Flyers she posted were torn down within hours. One department chair even warned her, privately, off the record, that she was risking her future in higher education. It wasn't just betrayal. It was blacklisting. Elijah and Vanessa continued to communicate, though cautiously. They met infrequently, always in public places, their phones often turned off. They spoke in code, aware that retaliation wasn't just possible, it was already happening. Protesters had gathered outside Elijah's lawyer's office. Some were supporters, but others wore suits and carried cameras, documenting every move, every soundbite, every misstep to be used later in court or headlines. Then came the email. Late one night, an anonymous whistleblower leaked a university memo to Miles Durant, dated 2 weeks before the disciplinary hearing. It had been written by a dean in the mathematics department. The subject line read, Braxton Risk and Optics. The contents were damning. If Professor Braxton moves forward with external inquiries, it read, we must initiate preemptive internal review to maintain public confidence in the department's oversight. Another line chilled Miles to his core. Prepare a contingency plan should the Santa equation exposure gain media traction. It meant they knew. Before Elijah ever solved the equation, before the disciplinary letter ever arrived, Harvard knew what was coming, and they didn't plan to stop it. They planned to spin it. Miles shared the memo with Elijah, sliding the printed copy across the table during a late-night legal strategy session. Elijah scanned the text slowly, his eyes locking onto the timestamps. It wasn't just negligence. It was coordinated, intentional, betrayal baked into the institutional fabric. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was quiet. They weren't afraid of the truth. They were afraid of what it would reveal about them. The next day, Elijah gave his first national television interview. The host introduced him as the most controversial scholar in America. But Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't beg for vindication. Instead, he laid bare the machinery behind elite institutions. How they elevate black minds, until those minds start asking questions. How allyship disappears the moment whiteness feels threatened. How betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it comes in silence, in inaction, in strategic neutrality. The interview went viral, but with the leak in hand, Elijah and Miles now faced a crossroads. The memo was the smoking gun. It could bring down reputations, maybe even careers. But it would also invite more danger, more surveillance, more legal counterattacks. The next move had to be calculated, and public. They had to decide keep fighting quietly, or expose everything. The leaked email suggested Harvard knew the truth all along, and chose the cover-up anyway. Now Elijah had proof. What would he do? Did it? The courtroom wasn't built for justice. It was built for performance. As Elijah Braxton stepped into the federal courthouse, the halls echoed with a tension that went beyond legal procedure. This wasn't just a trial. It was a spectacle. Reporters crowded outside, social media buzzed with speculative hashtags, and every corner of the country had formed an opinion long before opening statements began. Inside, the polished wood and gilded trim did little to mask the reality. Elijah, a black professor who had committed no crime, was being tried for defying the narrative America preferred for men like him. Harvard had hired Alan Kravitz, a celebrity lawyer known less for ethics and more for theatrics. He had previously defended billionaires, accused of racial discrimination, and turned their guilt into profitable settlements. His arrival was cinematic, tailored suits, publicist in tow, flashbulbs dancing in his wake. From the outset, he framed Elijah as arrogant, reckless, and self-serving. Not a professor, not a patriot, just another problem case the system needed to contain. Across the aisle sat Travis Klein, untouched and smug. He had accepted full immunity in exchange for cooperating with the prosecution. He wasn't charged. He wasn't even reprimanded. Now he sat clean-shaven in a navy blazer, casting rehearsed glances at the jury box as if he were the victim. The same student who had bragged about framing Elijah was now the federal government's key witness. Vanessa's audio recording, the one that captured Travis admitting to the entire setup, was ruled inadmissible. The court claimed it lacked verifiable chain of custody and had been recorded without consent. Never mind that it was clear, time-stamped and truthful. The rules weren't designed for justice. They were built to protect those who understood how to bend them. Without that recording, Elijah's defense was gasping for air. Elijah's team introduced metadata logs, showing Travis's early access to the Santa equation. They presented time-stamped emails, system footprints, and security flaws that allowed Travis to weaponize access. But the prosecution downplayed every fact. They argued Elijah had still opened the file. That alone, they said, was enough to trigger a breach. Intent is irrelevant when national security is compromised. The prosecutor repeated, turning the courtroom into a pageant of fear. Then came the personal attacks. The prosecutor brought up Elijah's juvenile school record, a scuffle at age 13. Does this reflect a pattern of defiance toward authority? He asked, with a tone steeped in prejudice. Later, he grilled Elijah on whether he'd ever felt anger toward white institutions. The objection from Elijah's lawyer was immediate and sustained by the judge, but the question had been heard. The jury had absorbed it, and that was the point. Outside the courthouse, headlines did their part. Media outlets twisted soundbites into character assassinations. Harvard professor once suspended in high school faces espionage charges. Read 1. Commentators debated whether Elijah's genius had made him dangerous. Some conservative pundits suggested he was proof affirmative action went too far. Others painted him as an arrogant token who finally got what he deserved. The racism was no longer hidden. It was viral. Elijah remained composed. But inside, the pressure gnawed at him. Every cross-examination wasn't just about defending himself. It was about defending the very right to exist as a brilliant black mind in a system built to suppress it. His posture was straight, but his thoughts were a storm. He knew this wasn't about the equation anymore. It was about making an example out of him. Meanwhile, Vanessa worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Cut off from academic access and shadowed by university threats, she had nothing to lose. Every night she combed through backups, drives, and caches, looking for a crack in the fortress Travis had built. And then, finally, it happened. In an old autosave Gmail backup from her graduate research sync, Vanessa found it, an email Travis had sent to a friend days before Elijah received the Santa equation. Subject line: let's see if he takes the bait. The body of the email was a confession in plain text, Travis laying out the plan to humiliate Elijah, trigger the system, and watch the fireworks. It wasn't a recording. It wasn't hearsay. It was documented, written proof, with dates, a sender and recipient, that Travis had premeditated the entire entrapment. Vanessa sat frozen, rereading it, heart racing. This wasn't just a breakthrough. It was admissible, and it could dismantle Harvard's entire defense. Just when hope seems lost, Vanessa discovers a backup email Travis forgot to delete, proving he planned everything. The courtroom air was stale, a mixture of tension and the faint aroma of overbrewed coffee. For weeks, Elijah Braxton had sat in a tailored suit, under the blinding fluorescence of justice. His every breath dissected, his intellect questioned, his blackness weaponized against him. Harvard's legal team had painted him as a reckless prodigy blinded by ego. The Department of Defense framed him as a national threat in polished rhetoric. And through it all, the jury watched, unreadable, until Vanessa King found the email. It was buried in a forgotten folder on Travis Klein's university email account. A backup cache not synced to Harvard's central servers. Vanessa, sleepless and wired on cold coffee and righteous fury, had accessed it through a data recovery tool a fellow student hacker taught her to use back when she was fighting for lab access. She had no idea what she was looking for, only that Travis had slipped somewhere, and there it was. The email, dated 3 days before Elijah received the Santa equation, showed Travis forwarding a copy of the problem to himself from a faculty account. Not just any account. The Dean of Mathematics, C. Reynolds. The metadata showed the login had come from a private IP, registered to Reynolds' home server. The implication was immediate, devastating and impossible to dismiss. Travis hadn't just framed Elijah, he'd done it using access only a handful of people on campus possessed, and the dean was either complicit or criminally negligent. The moment Vanessa printed the email and brought it to Miles Durant, Elijah's civil rights lawyer, the rhythm of the trial changed. Miles submitted the document into a supplemental evidence motion. Bypassing traditional channels, the prosecution attempted to suppress it, arguing chain of custody issues. But the metadata didn't lie, and neither did the timestamps. Harvard had known. More damning was the revelation that the email had been manually deleted from the dean's server days after Elijah was detained. The cover-up extended beyond Travis. At least 3 administrators had received CCs on internal discussions about potential exposure and limiting institutional liability. In other words, Harvard saw the racial injustice unfolding in real time and chose silence over truth. The judge allowed the email into evidence. As it was read aloud in court, a visible ripple moved through the gallery. A journalist from the Boston Globe put down his pen. A Harvard alum on the jury shifted in her seat. The image of the prestigious institution's cold, bureaucratic racism became undeniable. Elijah sat still, his face unreadable, but his fingers gripped the edge of his chair like a man holding back a tsunami of emotion. Outside the courthouse, the story exploded. News anchors abandoned scripts. Hashtags trended globally. Then Harvard lied, and Dun Braxton truth became battle cries. Harvard's spokesperson refused interviews. Anonymous faculty began leaking more emails. Whistleblowers surfaced like ghosts from the cracks of academia, each with damning receipts. One showed the dean requesting that Travis's student record be cleansed for optics. Another revealed that a planned diversity audit had been cancelled after Elijah's tenure was confirmed, deciding a sufficient diversity showcase now in place. The lawsuit morphed. What began as a racial discrimination case now invoked the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO. The language of mafia takedowns now applied to Ivy League academia. Elijah Braxton wasn't just a wronged professor anymore. He was a civil rights powder keg, threatening to dismantle a billion-dollar brand built on polished brochures and empty statements about equity. Miles Durant, once dismissed as a loudmouth activist in a suit, was now standing behind podiums on every major network. "This isn't about one man," he said during a CNN interview, his tone cutting and controlled. "This is about an institution that traded black genius for white comfort." Harvard didn't just let this happen, it engineered it. Within days, donors began pulling out. A major pharmaceutical foundation paused its $80 million grant. A high-profile black commencement speaker publicly withdrew. The dominoes were falling, fast and loud. Elijah, however, remained strangely silent. When asked for comment, he simply said, "Truth doesn't need a megaphone. It just needs a moment." Back in court, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The email had shifted the burden of proof. Harvard's defense scrambled, pivoted, contradicted itself. Travis Klein, once protected under immunity, now looked like a sacrificial lamb in a suit too big for his trembling frame. The dean, Reynolds, had vacated his position, citing medical leave. But the public knew better. The wolves were circling. Then, just as the defense prepared to cross-examine Vanessa, the judge received a sealed envelope from a federal courier. His brow furrowed as he read the contents. Whispers rippled across the courtroom. After a long pause, he adjusted his glasses, looked out over the room and said, "This trial is hereby suspended until further notice, pending review of a confidential brief submitted to the bench." Gasps erupted. Elijah turned to Miles, his eyes demanding answers. Vanessa clutched her notebook like a shield. No one knew what was in the envelope, but whatever it was, it had the power to freeze one of the most explosive trials in academic history. The room didn't empty quickly. It lingered in confusion, theories crackling in the air, like static electricity. But one thing was certain. Elijah had been underestimated for the last time, and now something darker and far more dangerous was rising from the shadows Harvard thought it had buried. The judge receives a confidential brief and suspends the trial unexpectedly. The ripple effect began as a murmur, but its shockwaves hit Harvard like a seismic quake. Less than 72 hours after Travis's damning email was uncovered, 3 former university staff members came forward, not to the university's internal affairs or board of trustees, but directly to the press. Their testimonies weren't framed as revenge. They were confessions, layered with guilt, frustration, and a long-awaited reckoning. The first to step forward was Candace Lowell, who had worked quietly for over a decade in Harvard's Office of Academic Affairs. She appeared on live television, her voice steady despite the storm she was about to unleash. She described how Elijah Braxton had once been shortlisted for the Manning Prize for Mathematical Innovation, a high-level academic honor, but his name was intentionally removed. When I asked why, she explained, "A senior administrator told me, he already got tenure, he's had enough attention." The implication was clear. Elijah's success needed to be capped. Next came Franklin Meeks, a former IT security officer, now retired. He was older, cautious in his wording, but resolute in his truth. He confessed that during the early days of the internal investigation into Elijah, he had been pressured to tamper with access logs and reroute server activity to mask internal discrepancies. "They told me it was protocol," he said, "but it wasn't. They wanted to bury the trail leading to Travis. I didn't delete everything, and now I'm glad I didn't." Then came the most explosive revelation, from Sheila Bryant, a former admissions liaison, who had left Harvard abruptly the previous year. Her voice trembled as she spoke. not out of fear but because of the weight of suppressed outrage. She exposed an unofficial policy known internally as diversity saturation review. It was a covert process used to reject black applicants deemed redundant based on existing diversity optics. After Elijah made tenure, she revealed, administrators used him as proof we didn't need more high-performing black students. One year, a valedictorian with perfect scores was denied admission. I was told we've already filled the quota. He'd just be another Braxton. The media ate it up. Within 2 days, the Department of Justice launched a formal civil investigation into Harvard's hiring, admission, and disciplinary practices. The story had officially outgrown Elijah. It had turned into a full-blown institutional exposé. The House of Ivy had begun to rot from within, and now the world was watching it fall. As public interest surged, so did entertainment interest. Netflix, Hulu, HBO and every major documentary studio sent offers to Elijah's legal team. Multi-million-dollar deals, streaming rights, docuseries proposals. They all wanted to turn his tragedy into a cultural moment. Book publishers followed, as did podcast producers. Everyone wanted the story. Everyone wanted Elijah to speak, but Elijah declined every single offer. He made it clear to Miles Durant, his lawyer, I'm not selling this pain. I want accountability, not a platform. The media spun it as grace. But it was something deeper: refusal to let others narrate his story for profit. Elijah wasn't interested in becoming a martyr, nor a symbol of pain for corporate consumption. He wanted structural change, not temporary applause. Meanwhile, the cultural conversation ignited. Major universities began reassessing their tenure practices. Students nationwide protested with banners that read, "Black genius is not a threat." Think pieces dissected the emotional toll of being the lone black academic in white spaces. Social media rallied around the phrase, "Protect Black brilliance." But the most powerful moment didn't come from a journalist or a whistleblower. It came from Elijah's own mother. Her name was Camille Braxton, a retired public school teacher in Atlanta. Until now, she had remained silent. But that changed with an op-ed published in the New York Times, titled "Too Fast to Be Safe." In it, she recalled an incident from Elijah's high school years, an episode he had never spoken of publicly. When Elijah was in 10th grade, he had nearly been expelled, not for cheating, not for fighting, but for solving math problems too fast. According to the school, he had disrupted learning by finishing tests in half the allotted time and challenging teachers' equations in class. They claimed he was trying to embarrass his teacher, Camille wrote. But what he was really doing was thinking at a speed they didn't expect from a black boy. He was suspended for disciplinary defiance. His perfect test scores weren't celebrated. They were treated as a threat. That day, Camille wrote, I realized the world wasn't afraid of my son failing. They were afraid of him succeeding too loudly. Her words ignited the internet. Within hours, the hashtag #TooFastToBeSafe was trending worldwide. People from all walks of life shared stories of being punished for excelling beyond society's comfort zone. Teachers, engineers, lawyers, and even NASA scientists spoke about being silenced, sidelined, or gaslighted for being too smart while black. Elijah read the op-ed from his lawyer's phone during a break in court proceedings. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. But the stillness in his eyes was deeper than grief. It was the quiet power of truth finally breaking the surface. The public now had a full picture. Not just of a man wronged, but of a lifetime of suppression wrapped in elite diplomas and polite racism. Elijah wasn't just a genius, he was a mirror to America's fear of what black excellence might mean when it refuses to shrink. And yet, through all the noise, Elijah remained silent. Not because he was hiding, but because for the first time, the world was finally talking without needing him to explain. Elijah's mother, long silent, publicly shares that Elijah was nearly expelled in high school for solving problems too fast. The courtroom had never been this silent. Not even when the Department of Defense testified. Not even when the voice recording was ruled inadmissible. It was a silence that stretched time, holding everyone's breath hostage as they waited for the hammer to fall. Elijah Braxton sat still at the plaintiff's table, not blinking, not shifting, just watching, but not the judge. His eyes lingered on the empty chair once occupied by Travis Klein, now removed after Travis's expulsion halfway through the trial. That chair, more than any legal statement, symbolized how far the lies had fallen. When the judge finally spoke, her words felt like iron dropped into water, cold, heavy, irreversible. In the matter of Braxton versus Harvard University, and the United States Department of Defense. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Elijah Braxton. A single exhale from the gallery broke the tension, followed by a gasp that rippled across the room like wind through dry leaves. The judge continued, methodical and unflinching. Harvard was found guilty on multiple counts: racial discrimination, malicious defamation, academic sabotage, and systemic negligence. The Department of Defense was not spared. They were ruled complicit in unlawful detainment and procedural failure. And then came the sum, $125 million, in damages. The number echoed like thunder. But that wasn't the end of it. The judge went further, ordering that Harvard undergo a mandatory diversity restructuring, enforce external audits, establish a permanent whistleblower protection office, and completely overhaul its tenure review process. A third-party racial equity commission would be embedded on campus for a minimum of 5 years. For the first time in its 400-year history, Harvard had been declared, by legal authority, guilty of institutional racism. Camera flashes lit up like lightning. Reporters dashed out of the courtroom, fingers flying across keyboards. Screens outside the courthouse began flashing breaking news. Harvard found guilty. But inside, Elijah remained still. Across the aisle, Harvard's defense team sat frozen, their posture crumbling under the verdict's weight. The institution that had once paraded itself as the pinnacle of intellectual integrity was now exposed as deeply fallible, even corrupt. Dean Charles Reynolds, the man who once told Elijah that black minds lacked mathematical discipline, had already resigned, quietly, strategically, 2 hours before the verdict, hoping to soften the blow. But history wouldn't forget his name. Nor would Elijah. The judge turned her gaze toward Elijah and said, "This court recognizes not only your professional excellence, Mr. Braxton, but also your endurance and grace under injustice. You were not just wronged. You were silenced, framed, and left to rot inside a system built to fear you. And yet, you solved every problem, even the ones they hoped you never would." Applause broke out in the gallery, not the kind forced by decorum, the kind pulled from the gut, emotional, exhausted, defiant. Elijah didn't raise his hands. He didn't cry. He stood and gave the room a single nod. It wasn't relief. It wasn't triumph. It was acknowledgement. He knew this verdict didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the betrayal, the scar, the silence from those who had once called him a symbol of diversity. But it was a beginning. Outside the courthouse, crowds flooded the steps. Protesters, supporters, former students. Dozens held signs that read, "Black genius is not a threat," and "Truth solved the equation." Vanessa King stood among them, face lifted to the sun, no longer just a former assistant, but part of a movement. When Elijah emerged, microphones shot forward. Journalists screamed his name. Everyone wanted the first quote, the first headline. What would he do with the money? How did it feel to win? What came next? He stepped to the podium. "I'm declining the payout." The silence returned, this time heavier. Even Miles Durant, his lawyer, looked over in disbelief. "I didn't fight for money," Elijah continued. "I didn't survive this for a settlement. I fought to dismantle a system that eats its best minds in fear of losing its worst traditions." And then he made the announcement no one saw coming. "I'm founding an independent, black-led math institute, the first of its kind, a place where brilliance isn't questioned, feared, or used as camouflage for institutional quotas. A place where no student will have to shrink to survive." His voice was calm, but his words cracked the air. Not defiance, declaration. In a matter of minutes, he had flipped the narrative again. He wasn't just a survivor. He wasn't even a symbol anymore. He was a builder. While institutions scrambled to salvage their reputations, Elijah Braxton walked off that podium, not into a university, not into a media deal, but into the future he would now define for himself and every brilliant mind like him. Elijah declines the money and announces he's founding an independent black math institute instead. The news of Harvard's defeat traveled fast, but what followed was even more unexpected. Instead of reveling in the $125 million verdict, Elijah Braxton shocked the world. By declining the full payout, he kept only a portion to cover legal costs. The rest he redirected towards something far more permanent, something that couldn't be erased by a memo or silenced by policy. He announced the founding of the Black Mathematics Institute, the first of its kind in the country. Independent, privately funded, and unapologetically designed to center black genius without apology or compromise. The announcement shook elite academic circles. Journalists flooded his inbox, begging for interviews. Former critics begged to revisit their stories. Documentary filmmakers competed for exclusive rights. Publishing houses offered million-dollar advances. But Elijah said no to them all. His story wasn't for profit. It was a warning and a blueprint. The institute launched in a modest brick building on the outskirts of Atlanta, far from Harvard's marble towers, but rich with something more valuable: freedom. No legacy donors, no biased gatekeepers, just brilliance, raw and unfiltered. Students were accepted not through standardized test scores, but through interviews, portfolios, and demonstrated curiosity. The admissions committee didn't look for obedience, it looked for hunger. On the first day, Elijah arrived early. The building was still quiet, the sun not yet above the treetops. He walked the halls, fingers grazing the freshly painted walls, listening to the echo of possibility. There were no portraits of deans or donors. Instead, each hallway bore quotes from Black thinkers, revolutionaries and mathematicians whose names had been buried by time. This was more than a school, it was a resurrection. Just before 9 a.m., the front door creaked open. A single student stepped in. Her name was Raya Monroe, 17, homeschooled, from Baton Rouge. Her transcript had been dismissed by every Ivy League school she'd applied to. Too non-traditional, too many gaps, not enough AP classes. But her application to Elijah's institute had been a quiet storm. In her personal essay she wrote, "I don't want to study math to impress them. I want to use math to free us." Elijah greeted her himself. No ceremony, no performance, just two people standing in a space built from ashes. He showed her around. The modest classrooms, the algorithm lab, the communal kitchen stocked with donated groceries. "There's no hierarchy here," he told her. "Just curiosity, collaboration, and fire." Rhea listened, eyes sharp. "So, we just build what we want." Elijah smiled. "We build what they were afraid of." More students arrived, one from Detroit, one from Oakland, another from rural Mississippi. By noon, the hallways echoed with voices that had long been told they were too loud, too fast, too much. And now those same voices were solving recursive matrices and debating theoretical limits of mathematical justice, not for grades, but for survival. Word spread quickly. In the first week alone, over 10,000 students submitted interest forms online. The institute's servers crashed twice. Elijah refused to cap enrollment, instead creating rotating cohorts, virtual fellowships, and satellite hubs. The institute wasn't trying to recreate Harvard, it was trying to replace it. But even as the institute grew, threats loomed. Right-wing pundits labeled it a separatist cult. Politicians questioned its accreditation. A smear campaign accused Elijah of indoctrinating youth with anti-American rhetoric. Anonymous death threats escalated. At one point, the FBI contacted him again, this time claiming they were monitoring potential extremism. Elijah responded with a single press release: "Mathematics is not extremism. But silencing truth is." Through it all, Raya became the institute's soul. She worked late, mentored younger students, challenged Elijah in seminars. One afternoon she quietly asked him, "Do you ever miss it? The prestige, the stage?" He paused before answering, "Prestige is just a tax they make us pay to feel visible." This, he gestured to the chalk-streaked boards, the students arguing passionately over an equation. "This is liberation." The twist came weeks later, when Harvard's new interim dean reached out. She proposed a collaborative partnership, offering shared resources, cross-registration, even co-branded initiatives. Elijah read the email twice, then deleted it without reply. Because partnership in their language meant absorption, and he hadn't come this far to be absorbed. The institute kept rising. Students began publishing original research that drew international attention. Tech firms offered funding. Elijah refused any check that came with conditions. The institute would remain free, independent, unapologetic. And then came the moment no one expected. The White House extended an invitation. The president wanted to meet Elijah personally, to recognize his contribution to American education. Elijah declined. He sent Raya instead, and she, standing tall in a press room filled with cameras, said, "We're not here to be recognized, we're here to be reckoned with." Just as the institute celebrates its first semester, a mysterious package arrives for Elijah, marked with the same symbol as the Santa equation. The package arrived 3 weeks after the institute opened, No name, no return address, just a pristine white envelope, with a silver seal. Elijah Braxton held it delicately, as if it were radioactive, because in a way, it carried the same sterile weight as the one that had started this war, the one marked Santa's impossible equation. But this time, the seal bore no mocking holiday font. Just an embossed triangle, the mathematical symbol for change. Elijah opened it slowly, seated in the quiet center of his newly christened Black Mathematics Institute. The walls around him still smelled of fresh paint. Students buzzed down the hall, their laughter bouncing between the steel beams and unpolished brilliance. Here, in this space built from trauma and defiance, intellect was no longer filtered by fear. Inside the envelope was a sheet of paper, elegantly formatted, numbers and variables dancing like a symphony of logic. At first glance it resembled the Santa equation. Familiar architecture, nested parameters, recursive illusions. But this one was different. It didn't seek a solution. It resisted one. The equation was unsolvable, by design. A trap. But not for him. Elijah's mind worked through the architecture instinctively. His fingers hovered over imaginary chalk. He saw it instantly. The contradictions hidden within the logic. The false symmetry, the recursive dead ends, meant to loop indefinitely. This wasn't a puzzle meant to test genius. It was a weapon, a decoy, bait. He leaned back in his chair, heart calm, eyes focused. Whoever sent this thought they were setting another trap. But Elijah no longer lived within the system that rewarded solving white-built mazes for validation. He knew the real cost of chasing brilliance defined by someone else's metrics. He remembered what it felt like to lose everything, to have his name dragged, his worth questioned, his freedom stolen, all because he had dared to be exceptional, without permission. Now they wanted him to bite again. Instead he laughed. A slow, quiet chuckle that broke the silence of his office. He stood, walked to the board behind him, and instead of solving the equation, he erased a corner of space and wrote 6 words. We don't solve cages. We shatter them. That afternoon he gathered his students, all first generation, all brilliant, all black or brown, and handed them the equation, not to solve, but to deconstruct. To understand who builds the cage, he said, is more important than learning how to survive inside it. Their eyes lit up, not with fear, but with purpose. Over the next 2 weeks, the institute transformed. It wasn't just a school anymore. It was a lab, a think tank, a sanctuary. And Elijah wasn't just a professor. He was a liberator. Every lesson was a dismantling. Every student became a builder of new systems, not a pawn in old ones. The world watched with cautious curiosity. Some still doubted him. Others feared him. But none could ignore the shift he'd created. Because the Santa equation had finally revealed its true purpose. Not a measure of intelligence, but a mirror to power. And Elijah had taught an entire generation how to see it for what it was. As the media waits for Elijah to release his solution, he issues a single statement. We're not solving your equation. We're building our own. They tried to silence him, erase him, break him. But Elijah Braxton turned their trap into a blueprint for every black mind told they don't belong. If you've ever felt invisible for being too brilliant, too bold, or too different, this story was for you. Type yes if you believe in justice. Subscribe if this broke your heart.